Honorable Member for Vieux South.
Go ahead.
Slow. Sean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Castries South gave what I regard as masterful replies to the budget proposals of the Minister of Finance. They eviscerated and dismembered the corpus of that budget. And they did so brilliantly. It's now for those who have followed them to complete the funeral rites and bury this budget in the sands of time. This budget, Mr. Speaker, will go down in our parliamentary history as one of the worst budgets ever presented in this honorable House. To be frank, Mr. Speaker, I experienced considerable difficulty in characterizing this budget. Like its predecessor budget in 2017-18, there were declarations of intent, grandiose promises, fleeting proposals with no programs or projects to reflect the decisions. Two examples spring to mind very quickly. The first, Mr. Speaker, after 2 years, the Minister of Finance confesses that he does not know what to do about St. Jude. An actual recorded confession. Then he talks about defaulting properties, toxic properties, the requirement for foreclosure. We heard so the previous year. And he says he's still consulting, he hasn't made a decision. So the Minister of Finance touches an issue, drops it, and runs to another issue. When you really think about it, Mr. Speaker, this budget is a tip and run budget. The out goes in is a tip and run. I'm sure you know what tip and run means, Mr. Speaker. After all, you're from Dennery North area, the Dennery Valley, and must have played Wallaby in your youth. If you did not play it, then you must have seen it. And you know what tip and run means, basically, that as soon as you touch the ball, you have to run. No matter how close or how far the ball may be, but you run. You tip and you run. And this characterizes this Minister of Finance. Tips, drops, and run. But the biggest message, Mr. Speaker, and this is one message that resonates in this tip and run budget, is this: there will be no new taxes. How many times he said that, I think? About 3 times. No new taxes. But what caught my attention, Mr. Speaker, was the pronouncement at page 4 of the budget address. And if I may turn to that very quickly, Mr. Speaker, and I want to refer to this section, quote, "More than this, though, Mr. Speaker, we made the conscious decision to restructure the tax burden. The consequence is that the tax on fuel and its deployment to road maintenance repairs has directly benefited those who pay the tax. Similarly with the airport tax, the people who use the airport will benefit from improved facilities. The taxes are therefore more targeted. Apparently, Mr. Speaker, there's a new philosophy. If you benefit directly from a government service, then pay tax. That's the philosophy. So according to the Minister of Finance, that is the case with the airport tax. Quote, the people who use the airport will benefit from improved facilities. Now, what is the result of that? What is the result of that, Mr. Speaker? What burden are the people of St. Lucia required to bear with these increased taxes, particularly airport taxes? I have with me, Mr. Speaker, a ticket for travel from St. Lucia to Antigua. And this is with the new taxes that have been imposed on the traveling public. These are the range of taxes that anyone traveling to Antigua will have to pay. And I'm going to quote them. Quote them, Mr. Speaker. Airport administrator on charge, St. Lucia to Antigua, $37.50. FIS St. Lucia to Antigua, $7.25. St. Lucia Airport Development charge, $35 US. St. Lucia Airport Service charge, $25.19 US. Security surcharge, St. Lucia Antigua, $2.50 US. St. Lucia security charge, St. Lucia and Antigua to Antigua, $4.82 US. Service charge, $15 US. That is St. Lucia Antigua. St. Lucia ticket tax, $13.35. Now, I'm not going to include the Antigua St. Lucia end of it. But in those taxes alone, and accepting that one or two of those minor ones that I've mentioned may have been at the Antigua end, minor, and I'm not quoting the Antigua St. Lucia. The average St. Lucian is paying $140.61 from the St. Lucian end to Antigua, translated to $379.64 CC. That's the reality. And that is the cost of the taxation, the new taxation imposed on St. Lucians traveling abroad. And this, of course, Mr. Speaker, you are talking of people traveling within the region. Within the region, not even externally to the UK, so that if, for example, a family of 3 or 4 is traveling, then woe be unto you. And as I said, you can make plus or minuses depending, of course, for the minor taxes that may be imposed at the Antigua end, but the harsh and cold reality is that St. Lucians now carry an extraordinary tax, ostensibly to develop an airport. Mr. Speaker, that is the cold reality. But of course, the biggest con job in recent times has been the so-called gas tax. After all the fanfare, how I hid $60.80 on a gallon, up to this day they can't find it. To this very day they can't find it. Made noise about vehicle license tax. They will reduce it by 50%. It turns out they say 50% of the increase. And today, St. Lucians have been forced pay additional $1.50 on tax, $4 a gallon of gas. And I'll give them one credit. They know how to market their propaganda. I credit them for that. Telling everybody how the gas tax is to repair roads, and it's a dedicated tax to repair roads, as if the amount of money you get in from the gas tax is so much that it can repair so many roads, as if this was not done in the past. And the result, everyone has been conned because they end up having to pay more money to purchase fuel as they go from one end of St. Lucia to the next. But he proudly announces that no new taxes for this year, yet in the same breath, the Minister of Finance plans a new imposition on workers and employers. That is to happen, he says, before the end of this fiscal year. No new taxes, but a health imposition on workers. He says that employers and employees will make mandatory contributions in much the same way as they do now to the National Insurance Scheme. Mr. Speaker, the time will come to debate this proposal. But you can call it what you want. You can describe it how you want. You can call it contribution. You can call it imposition. You can call it levy. No matter what language you use, it is still a tax. Whether mandatory contribution or simply a contribution, it remains a tax. And he says that he plans to do this before the fiscal year ends. And then you say no new taxation. What this translates to and what it means is that the ordinary workers, the contributors to NIC workers and employers, will be taxed on their salaries and on their income to meet these costs. I can only speak for myself on this occasion, but I, for one, will never support any so-called national health insurance scheme that imposes further taxation on the incomes of workers or employers. But I await the debate. I await the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, we have a budget that the public debt continues to grow. And here are the words of the Minister of Finance. Quote, "Our public debt continues to grow as a consequence of deficits from previous budgets." He says so on page 47. Now, why would a Minister of Finance say such a thing? Why would a Minister of Finance say such a thing? In the same breath, he then goes on to say, although debt has grown at a slower pace of 4.9% over the preceding 3 years and translate to a debt GDP of 68.8%. So what he's trying to say was that while you may have had debt in the last 3 years, but what you have noticed is that a downward trend of borrowing, at least some minor concession to the former administration. But as I said in the estimates debate, this Minister of Finance had a unique opportunity. He is the beneficiary of the rebasing of the GDP figures. That gave him a clear 10 points. Reduced the debt GDP ratio by 10 points. Yet he squandered it. By his own admission, the debt GDP ratio is now 68.8%. On top of that, this budget is being financed by government instruments, including bonds to the amount of $233.12 million, other loans of $67.81 million. That, Mr. Speaker, is expressed at page 53. But last year, the Minister of Finance announced borrowing in the amount of $352 million. Whether, of course, he achieved his ambition, although he's touting that they did exceedingly well, everybody's buying their instruments. It means that in 2 years, last year and this year, if they are to be believed that everything was subscribed to, then $585 million will be borrowed to prop up this budget in 2 years. By the end of this financial year, Mr. Speaker, the debt-GDP ratio will be back in the 70s and will continue to climb. Now, curiously, this is one area where the opposition has a shared interest with the government of St. Lucia to deal with. But while there may be a shared interest in dealing with it, the problem is the honesty of the government of St. Lucia. These figures are cited, and I want to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, that the loans from Taiwan have not been factored in the calculations. I don't know whether the Minister of Finance believes that his so-called lockbox arrangement will save him from accounting for it in the public debt profile. We shall see. But the government is set to borrow US $100 million from Taiwan for the redevelopment of the Hiwanora International Airport. That's what he says at page 34. And if you read it carefully, Mr. Speaker, and I suggest you pay attention to the language of the Minister of Finance. He says, redevelopment of HIA will take place in a phased manner using concessional loan financing. We are currently finalizing the loan agreement with the Republic of China, Taiwan, for the US $100 million required. Speaks the language of loan financing. But that is not all. Later at page 51, he announces that the government has secured a loan of US $50 million from Taiwan, ostensibly for roads and schools. Now, this is interesting. Mr. Speaker, this is really interesting. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the former government was the beneficiary of a loan from Taiwan, and I can't remember whether it's 21 or 22 million for the St. Jude Hospital. I can't remember the exact amount. But in this instance here, the amount that is being loaned is $150 million from Taiwan in one shot. What a big investment. And thank you, member for Castro South. It translates to 400 million EC dollars. What explains this extraordinary generosity of the Taiwan government? Mr. Speaker, you will stop me. You will stop me, but I won't give you time. Mr. Speaker, I ask the question, is that the bribe? I changed the word, Mr. Speaker. I say, put it differently. Is that the reward for not breaking diplomatic ties with Taiwan? I'm coming to you. This Prime Minister talks of secret agreements and suspicious transactions by members of the opposition, albeit in their other capacities. I now pose these questions to the honorable gentleman. Did you, at the instigation and behest of Tioakin, explore the possibility of breaking ties with Taiwan in favor of the People's Republic of China? Did you send 2 ministers to the People's Republic of China with a shopping list to negotiate with the Chinese? Did the Chinese reject your offer because the price was too high? Is it because you are contemplating breaking ties with Taiwan that you did not make use of CDB funds in 2016, 2017? Is it a fact that the Taiwanese became aware of this? And did you, after that rejection, worm your way back to the Taiwanese, starting with a round of golf at Cap Estate? These are the questions for which we expect answers. And we urge those members who may have traveled to China to speak early and clear their names. You know, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the member for Castries South demonstrated that the government is now operating two budgets. The official budget debated in this House and an unofficial budget for which no allocation exists. But projects and programs have been announced by the Prime Minister. And he demonstrated this with forcefulness and clarity. A number of projects, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. I would refine this, Mr. Speaker, to say, not that there are two parallel budgets, but rather there are two parallel capital budgets. One official, the one in our estimates of expenditure, and the other unofficial. The question is why? Why would a Minister of Finance, after presenting estimates of revenue and expenditure, come to a Parliament, indicate financing for projects a mere week and a half after the debate on estimates of expenditure, for which no allocations have been made in the budget? Why? Why would any Minister of Finance engage in this kind of subterfuge, engage in this kind of behavior? Mr. Speaker, I will venture two reasons. One is concessionary, because I understand the logic. I understand the logic because there's been a long history to it. First, and the obvious reason, is that the Minister of Finance, faced with a rising portfolio of debt, wants to resort to PPP, bolt arrangements, and other related arrangements to escape inclusion of expenditure in the debt profile of the country. As I have said before, Mr. Speaker, is not an unusual approach. The former administration championed an approach where funds were utilized from the National Insurance Scheme to build infrastructure for the police, and the government proceeded to pay back by way of leasing. So we understand that. Secondly, and more significantly in recent times, given the cash problems that the government encountered during the financial adjustment period, the government had to turn to other sources of financing, and for that reason, turn to the private sector to raise their own funds in the banks and so finance projects that the government, in turn, could not have financed at a particular period. But thirdly, there is a more sinister reason why this approach is being used. It is that these projects this, it is thought, will escape the scrutiny and controls which exist and allow more room to give effect to the famous FFF contracts, contracts for family, friends, and foreigners. Why? Because our financial provisions are exceedingly weak in ensuring accountability where these projects are concerned. But let me sound a note of caution. Ultimately, the repayment of these loans, repayment of these financial packages have to be reflected in the estimates of revenue and expenditure. For example, Mr. Speaker, if you look at page 485, you will see that provision, 485 of the estimates, you will see that provision is made for several payments for projects undertaken by the Ministry of Infrastructure, and incidentally, by both governments. The problem now, Mr. Speaker, is this. All of these allocations must come out of the capital allocation of the Ministry of Infrastructure. The danger, Mr. Speaker, is that the overall allocation of the Ministry of Infrastructure can then become exhausted because it is consumed in these payments. The new projects, I note, Mr. Speaker, financed by loans incurred by contractors, your Fresh Start project down in Miku, other projects awarded by direct purchase contracts in some instances, I note have not been included in the schedule of payments. And Mr. Speaker, if these payments are included in your normal debt to GDP figures, then your debt changes. To date, Mr. Speaker, I note that Parliament has not granted approval to these projects. I repeat that these are loans. And apart from being loans, the reality is that parliamentary approval has to be obtained. All I can say at this stage, that time is running out to resolve these matters. Having said and made these comments about this budget, I now turn to three matters touching my constituency. I intend, Mr. Speaker, to touch on the status of St. Jude today, come back to the Vieux water supply project, and then I want to touch the DSH agreement. I will take them in order. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance says, quote, at page 29, "We have inherited a mess from the former government, and this has placed my government in a dilemma as it relates to the way forward," unquote. The question is this: if a mess exists, who created it? It is almost 2 years, and you don't know what to do? It was the member for Castries North, Mr. Speaker, who appointed the project manager as well as the project engineer and consultant to manage the project. To top it off, the person who is now the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance, or the Minister of Finance, was the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Health appointed to that post by the former government. And then he says, that the project had no planning and no vision. It astounds me that the Minister of Finance can say these things while a member for Castries North is sitting next to him. It astounds me that he conceptualized the project. He appointed the project manager. He appointed the project engineer, consultant, and then the accusation there was no planning and no vision. You know, Mr. Speaker, life really has twists and turns. I remember, Mr. Speaker, that the project manager appointed by the former Prime Minister prayed for the St. Lucia Labour Party to lose the last general elections. She prayed. She prayed openly. I never interfered with the politics. But you see, prayer is a very powerful thing. Sometimes what you pray for, and when you get it, it comes back to bite you, and you pay the consequences. In any event, Mr. Speaker, I have learned that prayer should never be used for doing what is wrong, Mr. Speaker. Never. Never. But what is amazing is that she is treated with contempt, lack of professional respect. She's treated like she's a common criminal. Your member, your former Minister of Health, Dr. Keith Wandesi, confirmed publicly that the plans were presented to and confirmed by your cabinet. The Minister of Finance and the member for Castries Southeast were part of that cabinet. In effect, Mr. Speaker, the structure that they complain about as being inadequate was designed by them. The former SLP government merely sourced the funds for the hospital as none was left or budgeted for when we assumed office. And I will not respond to the member Foswazell on this occasion, but to invite him to check the estimates from 2011 onwards, and then he can always report to the House on another occasion. Why this elaborate and orchestrated campaign to deceive the public? Why? No floors were broken down. Dr. Mondesi again confirmed that the former UWP administration was advised by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers not to break down the thick structure, just modify the internal walls. If the internal walls and rooms, which were built in accordance with the approved plans of the UWP cabinet, is inadequate in the eyes of this cabinet, then break them down and rebuild them to your specifications. Stop inventing excuses. But the estimated tag is not just for the building. It includes materials ordered for completion, and I make no comments about what happened to materials recently and where it went to. No comments. And the most modern equipment, all sitting in storage. But you know, Mr. Speaker, politics really has some twists and turns. And you can become very cynical after it all, Mr. Speaker. You know what has intrigued me, Mr. Speaker? When the Bois d'Orange Bridge was being constructed, there was a hue and cry. The honorable member was accused of corruption, I recall. There was a hue and cry that it cost $11 million. Hue and cry that it cost $11 million. It was excessive, although I see in the budget presentation by the Prime Minister, some three bridges are estimated to cost some $46 million. So that should be interesting as the weeks go by. And the very same person who designed the bridge, who in the first place is responsible for the cost because of this design, that individual was selected to do the technical audit for St. Jude. The noises were so loud, Mr. Speaker, that the audit department conducted an audit of the cost of the bridge. And it always seems to be the case that whenever you see the Labour Party is in office, they find some reason to do some audit. The same thing happened with the West Coast Road. Identical same thing. I recall that. Yet, Mr. Speaker, despite all what was said about the Bois Bridge, his judgment is trusted in the so-called audit of the hospital. And then we, on this side, are supposed to accept the idea that some $100 million is required to complete the hospital. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear this afternoon. Understand very clearly. The people of Vieux will not accept any glorified polyclinic as a substitute for and in exchange of the hospital. Understand that and let that resonate. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the DSH investment referred to by the Minister of Finance at page 36 of his presentation. Yes, I'm coming to it. Have no fear. Mr. Speaker, this project, and to echo, and this must be rare for me, the member for Ancillary Canneries, the so-called Pearl of the Caribbean, was announced in July 2016, mere days after the general elections of June 6, 2016. Mr. Teoa King was, I suspect, the first investor to appear publicly in St. Lucia after the general election. Given his appearance in St. Lucia just days after the elections, he must have been in what I will describe as a holding pattern, if I may use the language of the member for Labrie. He must have been somewhere hovering around, waiting for the election to be concluded. Now that is an interesting story, but the details will wait another occasion. This opposition party has given the government nearly 2 years to change course on this development. The position of the opposition has always been clear. Always. The opposition did not oppose development for the South, especially if it brought employment. But the terms offered by Teoa King and accepted by the Prime Minister were outrageous, unacceptable, and contrary to the public interest. For the last 2 years, we have urged the government to renegotiate the agreements. After nearly 2 years of pleading, protesting, demonstrating, the Minister of Finance now says that, quote, consultations with all stakeholders will take place to alert them to the opportunities that will open up and hear their ideas and concerns. I refer to the quote, Mr. Speaker, pages 36 and 37. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, this is too little, too late. The words of this Minister of Finance are hollow, unreliable, and fall short of truth. First, The race course will be completed in 2017. Everybody remember the announcement. Then, all over Facebook, social media, 2018. And now in this budget, we are told it's 2019. Mr. Speaker, as Parliamentary Representative, I have a duty to protect the patrimony of the people of Vieux. And when I speak of patrimony, I don't mean the definition which says their credit rating, Mr. Speaker. And to ensure that any development that comes their way is in their interest. That's my sacred responsibility. I maintain that the agreements with Vieux King are outrageous, in breach of the financial laws of St. Lucia, and contrary to the public interest. I want to make it clear that in the next few weeks, I will, in my capacity as Parliamentary Representative, move to the courts to secure appropriate declarations. I want to be very clear. We have met in other cases, and we will meet in this case. Don't let them get hold of you, you know. Don't let them ever get hold of you. And it looks to me like you are well on your way. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to come back to the Vieux water supply project. Mr. Speaker, during the debate on the estimates of expenditure, I asked several questions about the Vieux water supply redevelopment project. The Minister of Finance has apparently rechristened it as the Vieux North Water Supply Project. Now, Mr. Speaker, the comments by the Minister of Finance and the declarations regarding this project do not answer the questions which I posed. It will be recalled, Mr. Speaker, that the former government signed an agreement with the Caribbean Development Bank for a project costing some $19 million. The estimates of revenue and expenditure for this financial year at page 480 indicate that $4.8 million will be spent. Of that amount, $1.3 million is a CDB grant. $1.03 million will come from bonds. $2.5 million from other sources. The Minister of Finance confirms the allocation, and I refer you to page 39 of his budget address. My question is this: did the government of St. Lucia cancel the loan from CDB to improve the quality of water supplied to the people of Vieux and the South? And if so, why was it done? Why does the question arise? Why does it arise? If the CDB loan was not cancelled, why is it that in this financial year part of the expenditure will come from bonds and another part from other sources? Why? Why isn't the source of funding clearly indicated and established that it is the Caribbean Development Bank? Why? Mr. Speaker, if $4.8 million is going to be spent and the sources of expenditure are not very clearly defined, then obviously, Mr. Speaker, this is a project that will crawl at the whim and fancy of the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, it can never, ever be right that an entire community is being punished merely because they exercise their right to decide who will represent them. Mr. Speaker, much has been said, and there has been a lot of gloating, Mr. Speaker, about the rate of growth of this economy. I don't think anybody questions issues about growth of this economy. But you know what is startling? A week and a half ago, the Minister of Finance says the growth rate is 3%. His, of course, erstwhile minister in the Ministry of Finance was all over the place boasting about a 3% growth rate. But the Minister of Finance, of course, decided to be a little cautious and said estimated. But they then say, Mr. Speaker, that we are now on a growth path, sustainable growth path. This is the first time that growth is taking place.
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes remaining to conclude your...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, even in the last few years of financial adjustment, there was growth in this economy, bordering in 2 cases in the region of 3% or more. That's the reality, and that is what your economic report indicates. You should read it because you have a problem with reading. So, I don't know what this hue and cry is, as if this is the biggest achievement that an economy has grown by about 2.5%. Every economy in the Caribbean, except for Trinidad and Barbados, have showed growth. Everybody, as if this is something unique and something so extraordinary. But, Mr. Speaker, tanto, tanto. Mr. Speaker, we were all witness to a very, you know, I'll never accept time from you for sure. That I guarantee you. We were all witness to a very unusual statement by the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance at the commencement of his budget address. He accused members of this House in participating in suspicious undertakings. Mr. Speaker, this is almost unprecedented that a Minister of Finance will seek to use a budget address to cast aspersions on members of the opposite side. Curiously, in the process of delivering his statement, so pleased he must have been with himself, and perhaps in obedience to his rehearsals for his address, he directed his attention to myself, the member for Dennery North and the member for Castries South. It was, he may have thought, the ultimate arc of triumph. After declaring that the recent amendment to the Crown Proceedings Act blocked an escape route, and this is so laughable, blocked an escape route, as if he does not know that if you want to get redress against ministerial appointments, there are several provisions of the law that allows it in any event. So I don't know what he thought that he blocked. But he goes on to say, and I want to quote it, but the amendment of the Crown Proceedings Act was only the beginning. Mr. Speaker, there is still a lot of blinding smoke to be cleared from around a number of public concerns, including how we became embroiled in the material affairs of the Saudi billionaire, and what induced a former Prime Minister to partner with an American oil speculator notorious for his business practices. We must clear that suffocating smoke that conceals the truth about Mrs. Walid Jafali, Jack Greenberg, Robert Lindquist, St. Jude Hospital, and the infamous minister's account. I will pause just to make one little detour. One little detour. Robert Lindquist. The Minister of Finance announced publicly that he is setting up an investigation to investigate Robert Lindquist. And what does he do? What does he do? He takes it onto himself. He writes letters to individuals, asking the individuals about their involvement in the process of granting payments to Lindquist. Asking individuals about that. And Mr. Speaker, he is the one investigating, yet he himself is mentioned in the documents before the courts in Miami, before the judge in Miami, as being involved in the exchanges that took place when a censor was awarded the contract. How could you be investigating yourself? How you could do that? How you can do that when you stand accused of being involved in the decision-making process that led to the award of the contract or the attempted award of the contract to a sender? But this action by this government comes as no surprise. For months, I have been waiting for it. For months. But you made the first mistake. He made the first mistake. It is clear that his actions are motivated by revenge, malice, spite, and ill will. And to make matters worse, he is doing so at the direction and dictation of the publisher of the Star newspaper, who warned him that if he did not prosecute, he will campaign against him, as if, of course, these days he has political value.
Honorable member.
Yes, Mr.
I just find that statement of involving now the Star newspaper and casting some...
You found that, Mr. Speaker?
Yes. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker.
So...
Yes. Yeah, you found that, Mr. Speaker? The words direction and dictation are well known to you. They are words of art drawn from the epistle of the law, Mr. Speaker. So I can understand how you feel, Mr. Speaker. And if you feel it should be expounded from the record, that's fine, it doesn't bother me. The point is, the point has been made. One thing I'll tell before I close, the Minister of Finance. I have been through persecution before. A commission of inquiry Rochester, East Coast, West Coast Road. I've been through all of that. I have been persecuted more than once. But he himself must never come to the altar of justice with unclean hands and mind. Don't do it. Do not do it. You pay the price for it. What I promise the Minister of Finance is this. When he embarks on whatever action he embarks, I will make sure that he reaps the whirlwind for his actions. On that note, Mr. Speaker, I thank you and wish you the very best. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.